Welcome to Americana Archives. Today's head-on is Backwoods Adventure, an old hunter's story of bygone days. The subhead-on says, Desperate struggle of two men with a pack of catamounts. Their marvelous escape from death. This article was reported from Irwina, Pennsylvania on February 21st. It says, a group of the fishermen and hunters of this section of Pennsylvania were gathered around the stove in the little tavern perched up among these hills the other day, telling yarns and discussing the prospects of the country. Even Rattlesnake Pete, some of whose stories appeared in the Times not long ago, was induced to leave his hut near Boileau Rocks and join the merry crowd. Every one of the well-known characters of the vicinity had told for the 100th time some favorite episode of his own or some fictitious person's life, and the listeners were getting tired and sleepy when a stranger, who had hitherto been unobserved in the rear of the crowd, spoke out. Friends, he said, you have not asked me to listen to the incidents you have related, but I do not believe in being entertained without furnishing some entertainment in return. So with your permission, I will give you an anecdote out of my personal history, which I can vouch for, however much you may be inclined to doubt its accuracy. This is my first visit to this part of the state, most of my days having been spent in Pike County. When I was a boy, the woods thereabouts were wild and covered with a thick underbrush, and many kinds of reptiles and animals abounded. The species known as the catamount existed in larger numbers than any other. You know the catamount is more like the panther than anything else, being larger and more ferocious than a wild cat. Our little village had been built on the edge of one of the longest stretches of woodland in the country, so that it only took a few minutes to bring you into the dense thickets. It was in the winter of 1838 that I am to tell you of. I was then about 13 years old, and as rugged and strong as most of the young men of 20 are in these times. All through the autumn, the catamount and the black snake had bothered the men cutting timber for home use. Several of the villagers had been badly hurt, and one old man was killed by the tricky animal. The boys always helped in hauling the logs and pieces of timber, driving the buck wagons from the woods to the houses where it was to be dumped. After old Uncle Simeon was killed, the women became badly scared and made the men go armed and wouldn't let us youngsters go on the teams. No more trouble occurred, however, until the winter set in. Everything was quiet then, and the fright caused by the accidents of the fall had passed away. One day a terrific snowstorm set in. The flakes came down so thick that we couldn't see from our window across the road to Sam Briggs' house. By dark, it had become 3 feet deep, and we could hardly get to the barn to feed the stock. About 7 o'clock it stopped snowing and began to blow very hard. It grew very cold also. We heaped great logs on the fire and had the blaze roaring up the chimney. The old man was resting quietly in the corner, smoking his pipe, and seemed not to care about what was going on, when suddenly we heard a long, deep growl coming from the woods. The old man knew what that meant. So did some of my older brothers. The catamounts, maddened by hunger and prevented by the storm from getting anything to eat, were coming in a body to the village. In a minute, all were astir. 2 of the boys started for the barn to see that the door was fast, so that the catamounts could not destroy the cattle. The rest of us were told to fasten the windows and hunt up the guns which were about the house somewhere. I went to close a window, and then I could see the dark pack rushing as fast as they could through the snow. The sky had cleared and the stars were out, so that I could see the folks at Briggs's and down the street were preparing for the hungry animals. I didn't get those blinds shut any too quick either, for the head of the gang were within a few yards of the house. Just as I was leaving the room, the old man came rushing through the hall saying, Jim and Jack had been headed off between here and the barn by the pack, and all the wildcats were on 'em. You bet there was a lively moving around then. The old man and Bill, an older brother, took the guns and went upstairs to the bedroom windows, looking out on the yard. We could hear the boys yelling for help amid the growls of the delighted animals. I put for an upper window, and there was a fearful sight. Jim had drawn his jackknife and was keeping the cats at bay, but poor Jake was helpless. A big fellow had him down, and Jake had his hands on the rascal's throat with an awful grip. 4 or 5 more of the gang were trying to get a show at Jake too. He kicked right and left and fought like a tiger. Jim had his hands full, even though he did have a knife. They got behind him and would jump on him. He gradually worked his way towards the house, however, and Sister Sue, a brave girl, with nerves like a soldier, was waiting to open the door and let him in. The old man fired from the window first, and one of the pack fell dead. Neither Bill nor the governor dared shoot at the animals right around Jake for fear of shooting him. It was awful, I tell you, friends. Bill put a charge on another of the fierce brutes, and he keeled over. By that time, some of the pack were devouring the first catamount that the old man had shot. But there were so many of them that even the two dead ones only drew away a few of the gang. Jim had put two of them out of the way and was working his way fast towards safety, but he was terribly weak from the wounds the cats had given him. He was perfectly cool though, and shouted once to Bill, "Kill another blackguard, and then enough of them will be busy eating to give me time." Bill cracked away, and down went a catamount close to Jim. 2 or 3 of the beasts jumped on the wounded members of the pack, and Jim made a dash for the door. Sue had it unfastened, and the minute he reached the steps, she threw it open, and he rushed in. But by George, one of the hungry rascals sprang in with him. Then I tell you there was fun. Sue had a big meat knife in her hand, and she stabbed the brute, but it only exasperated him. It went for her right away, and in a moment there was a cut down her pretty cheek that left a scar she always carried afterward. Jim turned as quick as a flash and buried his jackknife deep in the brute's throat. It was a stunner, but before the animal expired, he gave Jim a dig in the right hand that was sore for a good many weeks. Meanwhile, Jake was struggling out in the yard. How he held out as he did with a half-dozen bloodthirsty beasts about him is more than I could ever understand. When I stopped watching Jim and looked again to where Jake was, he was all torn and bloody. You wouldn't have known him, so disfigured by the catamounts was he. The only thing that saved him was the fact that some of the neighbors, hearing the noise of the guns, had come out to lend assistance. The instant they came near the house, the animals scented them, and all but 2 left Jake. No sooner had they gone than Jim rushed out of the house, followed by Sue. I told you she was a brave girl, didn't I? Instead of making a big fuss over the cut in her face, she never thought of herself, but only of Jake. The 2 catamounts left Jake right away when they saw Jim and Sue and started for them. While one of the rascals was midway between Jake and Sue, the old man put enough shot in him to end his life. Jim got the first dive at the other one and stabbed him in the neck. Sue was by his side and put the old butcher knife behind one of his ears. That settled the business. Poor Jake was nearly dead indeed. They picked him up unconscious. He lived for about a month, but the strain had been too great, and he died from the effects of the fight. The rest of the pack were killed by the neighbors, although they caused considerable trouble. This story came from the great state of Illinois, being reported in the Quincy Daily Whig of February 27, 1880. Thank you for joining us today. If you want to continue to uncover all of America's lost and forgotten history, then remember before you leave to hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, and remember to like and comment below. And we will see you next time on Americana Archives.